Cobrapost revealed how immoral and corrupt most of India's mainstream news publications are.
The phenomenon of paid news is widespread.
आज का दिन मीडिया के लिए बहुत ही शर्म का दिन है।
It's one of the biggest stories out there right now, and the Indian media just doesn't seem to want to report about it.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. A journalist goes undercover in India to expose media companies willing to peddle propaganda dressed up as news for a price. Kremlin-funded news outlets are feeling the heat in the U.S. But what about Washington's own state-sponsored broadcast operations overseas? A real case of fake news, the resurrection of a journalist who was reportedly killed.
This is Nigeria.
And a music video born in America gets the Nigerian treatment.
Everybody be criminal.
We begin in India, and one of those stories that should have been major news but was conspicuously absent from television screens and newspapers there. Perhaps the subject matter was the issue: checkbook journalism, news outlets for hire. Cobrapost, an investigative news site with a penchant for undercover exposés, posted videos from a secret camera sting operation targeting 27 Indian media outlets, including some of the country's biggest. The videos show Cobrapost's undercover reporter posing as a Hindu nationalist, offering to pay media executives to publish some polarizing religious propaganda ahead of next year's general elections. This story touches on multiple issues, among them paid content disguised as news, as well as the ethics of hidden camera operations. For their part, some of the outlets implicated say that the videos have been doctored, that Cobrapost is untrustworthy. However, many Indian news outlets have credibility problems of their own, and it will take more than taking a few potshots at the messenger to make this story go away. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on a story that starts in New Delhi.
Now for a Times Now investigation with the India TV case, Operation Go Hatya Mein.
The Indian news media like nothing more than a good sting operation. So it is ironic that in a country where entire news bulletins and TV shows are built around such undercover investigations,
As Times Now sting operation done sting operation. Sting operation.
when it was the media that got caught on camera, almost none of India's mainstream outlets reported it. The Cobrapost sting targeted some of the country's biggest media groups: The Times of India, India Today, TV18, The Hindustan Times, and the footage produced was damning.
You have to look neutral, as neutral as possible.
You have the biggest names in the Indian media, from the biggest English group to most prominent news houses, with their very glittering offices, and everybody just falling over backwards to accommodate an advertiser who would have editorial command, who would sort of shape the narrative, as it were.
I'm not trying to protect my hidden agenda. I'm keeping it very upfront.
Please understand here, this story is not just about paid news. It is something beyond. They agreed to defame the political rivals of the client. They agreed to take compensation in cash.
So if you are giving me a couple of rupees to talk positive about you, automatically my editorial is under pressure. Not to go deep negative.
And they even agreed to not only peddle an ideology, but also in many ways to polarize Indian society. So in those terms, this is beyond paid news, this is criminal behavior.
Unfortunately, it's not surprising. I've run a newspaper in India, and it was clear to me then that was happening. There are rumors about how you can get a package of editorials written on the topic the way you want it written for money. So it's not surprising. What is surprising is the amount of money involved, the nature of what was being asked to be done, which is to kind of really interfere, if you will, in an election, in what is the largest democracy in the world.
Cobrapost called its expose Operation 136. That number refers to India's ranking in the media watchdog Reporters Without Borders' 2017 World Press Freedom Index. It's well down the list and has since slipped in the 2018 rankings to 138. Cobrapost's editor-in-chief Anirudh Bahal has a reputation as the master of the sting. He's been at it for more than 20 years. In 1997, he uncovered rampant match fixing in Indian cricket. In 2000, he ran an investigation of Indian MPs, showing how they solicited bribes for defense contracts. In 2003, Bahal founded Cobrapost and has since overseen numerous undercover investigations. They have made him rather unpopular in certain circles.
First thing, I do not believe in sting operations. As an editor and somebody who is a co-founder of a media company, I don't believe in sting operations except as a very last resort. And by that I mean when you have exhausted all the options, which includes giving the opposite party as many options to respond instead of just exposing them suddenly for all the world to see. That would be, to me, tantamount to like a policing operation or raiding somebody without giving them adequate space.
Cobrapost is a small non-profit organization. It is easy game. Nobody comments when, say, big channels like even Aaj Tak over the last 2 years has done possibly 70, if not more, hidden camera stories. Nobody talks about that. So, I mean, it becomes a sort of news angle to chew every time something significant is done, and it is really a spurious debate.
Cobrapost's undercover reporter Pushp Sharma approached his media targets with a detailed proposal and a fake persona. He presented himself as Acharya Atal, an activist straddling the line between politics and religion. At the heart of his proposal was a campaign to push Hindutva, the brand of Hindu nationalism for which India's ruling party, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP, has become known. On the tape, he made it clear that he was pushing Hindutva to divide Indian voters.
We can polarize or do some nasty kind of things.
And that his campaign was timed to have an effect on the general elections coming up in 2019.
So Hindutva is basically India for the Hindus, by the Hindus, of the Hindus. It can be compared to white nationalism and white supremacy. So this is Hindu supremacy. This entire exercise, this whole sting, is basically a way of showing you that the media is so eager. The media is a willing participant, as it were. At least that's what what comes across in these videos.
The same kind of sting, for example, could have been done with people who did not support the Hindutva or the Hindu argument. You see, when money goes beyond a certain volume, I don't see many of these big media houses saying no. Had the same exercise been repeated, say, with people who oppose the Hindutva, the results would have been pretty much the same.
Operation 136 was met with silence from most of India's mainstream outlets. They hardly covered it. Of the outlets targeted, 4 took legal steps, obtaining injunctions or issuing legal notices to Cobrapost, forcing the site to take down some of its videos. The India Today group, whose vice chairperson, Kalli Puri, was caught on camera, said the investigation was, quote, riddled with irresponsible and brazenly false statements designed to malign the company's reputation. India's largest media conglomerate, the Times Group, took a different tack. After its managing director Vineet Jain appeared on tape, the company announced the video had been doctored and that in fact the Times Group had been conducting its own reverse sting on Cobrapost when the undercover filming took place.
The idea of a reverse sting is laughable simply because it's like being caught speeding by a police officer and telling him, I was testing your cameras. So that makes no sense. It's a very poor defense of what was on tape. And other media companies have said the tapes are doctored, it doesn't show the full picture. But what it shows is quite damning.
I'm not surprised that it has not received the kind of play that the conductors of the sting would have wished. A, given the antecedents of this journalist, and B, the way the whole thing was set up, i.e. only targeting a political view, I'm not surprised that it got the kind of play it did.
The suspicion that Indian media outlets can be bought is not new. So for many, the Cobrapost sting simply confirmed what they had long suspected, and it did so at an already problematic time for Indian journalism. In the 4 years of the Narendra Modi government, polarization across the media has grown more extreme, the voices more shrill. The hounding of journalists by online mobs.
When did the death threats start coming?
Self-censorship in newsrooms. The killings of journalists, especially in smaller cities, away from the spotlight of Delhi and Mumbai. Most of the news about India's media has not been good.
India's role in the pantheon of free press is continuing to fall. To give you an example, Afghanistan, where there's a lot of terrorism, there's war, and journalists actually being killed in acts of violence, is ranked 118, well ahead of India in press freedom.
Here, there are media platforms promising to influence elections for you, and they are licensed companies, television companies and licensed newspapers. After this story, do you see them giving a public service? You don't. So that is the essential story about you. You are a public service. You are not doing public service. In fact, your inclination to do criminal acts is evident for all to see.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Johanna Hoos. Joe, at the risk of repeating ourselves, there have been more journalists murdered in Mexico.
That's right, Richard. 2 more in the past 2 weeks. Hector Gonzalez was a correspondent for Excelsior, a national daily based in the state of Tamaulipas in northern Mexico, which suffers from some of the worst cartel-related violence in the country. Now, last Tuesday, Gonzalez's beaten body was found dumped on the street in the outskirts of Ciudad Victoria. And just a few days before, on May 24th, financial journalist Alicia Diaz Gonzalez was found dead in her home in Monterrey, also in northern Mexico.
And these are not isolated cases, are they?
Far from it, Richard. Diaz and Gonzalez are the 5th and 6th journalists to be killed in Mexico this year alone. And the 4th was killed just last month. Juan Carlos Huerta was pulled out of his car and shot 12 times in the southeastern state of Tabasco. Now, over the past 6 years, 44 journalists have been murdered in Mexico. And according to every press freedom organization there, the overriding issue is impunity. The fact that killers of journalists are hardly ever brought to justice.
And then there was that bizarre story out of Ukraine. Journalist Arkady Babchenko. First, he was reported to be dead. Then he was very much alive. What point was he trying to make?
Babchenko wanted to point out how dangerous it is to be a Russian reporter critical of the Kremlin and President Putin. He left Russia just over a year ago, saying that he feared for his life, and he ended up working in Kiev, working for the Crimean TV channel ATR. Now, on Tuesday, we started getting reports that he had been shot and killed in what sounded like a professional hit. Ukraine's prime minister quickly accused Russia of ordering that killing. But on Wednesday, less than 24 hours later, Babchenko appeared on Ukrainian TV, very much alive, at a press conference about his own killing. Now, the head of Ukraine's security services told reporters that Babchenko's murder had been staged to expose Russian agents, and that those who had allegedly been plotting to kill him and 30 other people had been apprehended.
But the reaction from other media outlets and journalists seems to have been mostly negative. What have they been saying?
That it was ultimately counterproductive because it could conceivably allow Russia and other governments to dismiss future real events as fake news, and it may also undermine the trust in the media. The stunt seems to have lent credibility to the argument pushed in domestic Russian media and on channels such as RT that Western news outlets just love to jump on stories that smear Russia.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Late last year, 2 news organizations funded by the Russian government, RT and Sputnik, were forced to register as foreign agents in the United States at the insistence of the Department of Justice in Washington. The DOJ's orders were issued following claims by U.S. intelligence agencies that the 2 outlets were part of the Kremlin's alleged interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. And American lawmakers have since threatened other foreign-funded broadcasters, including this one, Al Jazeera, with similar measures. But what about the flip side of that? Namely, the U.S. government's own state-funded media operations that broadcast to 100 countries in more than 60 languages. Those stations include Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which have been lauded in some quarters for providing reliable reporting in countries with limited press freedom. However, like RT and Sputnik, they've also been accused of producing propaganda dressed up as news at the service of their sponsors in the State Department. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on U.S. state-funded media overseas and the at times muddy waters through which journalism and propaganda flow.
An American intelligence report finds that one of the weapons in the Kremlin's arsenal was its state-run news network, RT.
A congressional committee in the US has just revoked RT America's accreditation on Capitol Hill.
Since RT and Sputnik News were forced to register as foreign agents back in November 2017, US officials have threatened other government-funded broadcasters, like CGTN and Al Jazeera, with the same treatment. But the US government itself is no stranger to broadcasting into other countries. Its foreign media budget stands at $685 million, dwarfing the $450 million parceled out to domestic public broadcasters. The foreign media operation is run through the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the BBG, which houses 5 broadcasting centers under its umbrella. The Office of Cuba Broadcasting, based in Miami, is home to Radio and TV Marti. There's also Radio Free Asia, which covers the socialist and communist countries of Southeast Asia, and the Middle East broadcasting networks, including 24/7 Arabic language TV network Al Hurra. But the BBG's flagship stations are without doubt Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. As is the case with RT, whether their output is journalism or propaganda depends on who you ask.
If you look at what RFE-RL is broadcasting, it is news, it's information, it's moderate in tone, it's not propagandistic, it may have a stance, but the kinds of coverage really aren't that much different than you would find in the Washington Post or the New York Times or other major independent media.
The kind of cozy relationship that eventually emerged between Voice of America or Radio Free Europe and the propaganda machinery, whether it's the US State Department or CIA, is not cozy, it's just like employees. These are state-run.
Accurate reporting, reliable reporting, balanced reporting.
The budget comes from the State Department. There is no independence. Yes, news is being communicated, but in a way with a selected constellation of news that pushes forward a very particular line of understanding the world.
One of the questions that has arisen involving VOA and other broadcasters in recent years has been, are you simply providing journalism to those people? Or are you trying to agitate and fan the flames of resistance in any target country you're broadcasting to?
We shall speak to you about America and the war. The news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth.
Voice of America was started during World War II by the Office of War Information as a vehicle to counter Nazi propaganda.
Today, Europe also hears a new and forthright attack on Moscow from the transmitters of Radio Free Europe, a privately sponsored American organization which assails communism with no holds barred.
Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty began life during the early years of the Cold War as an opposition broadcasting station to the communist world. Their claim that they were privately sponsored was in fact a cover story. In truth, they were the product of CIA psychological warfare operations, and the agency continued to provide their funding and even senior staff until the early 1970s.
During the Cold War, we saw in different parts of Europe there was the same kind of lack of information as people were, stuck behind what we called then the Iron Curtain. And we didn't know at that point who was listening. And we just kept sending this news and information about what was really going on in the world, what the outside world was like.
Messages of peace and goodwill are to be relayed to those who've had enough of red propaganda.
And it was only after the wall came down that we began to hear from people and how important that lifeline of news and information was for them.
When these countries got their independence, their leaders and their freedom fighters, if you will, gave great credit to VOA and Radio Free Europe. When you look back at the broad history of the Cold War, RFE and RL played an important role. Part of it was news, but part of it was clearly propaganda.
Sometimes that propaganda took these Cold Warriors well beyond the traditional remit of journalists. In the 1960s, veteran CBS journalist Edward R. Murrow was appointed director of the United States Information Agency, or USIA, the body within the State Department that oversaw Voice of America.
Murrow was drafted in to boost the agency's prestige. In practice, he did more than that. This memo from Murrow to the CIA director of the time offered the support of the USIA's Cuba broadcasters to aid the CIA in its efforts to overthrow the Castro government. Broadcasts could urge Cubans, Murrow said, to engage in relatively safe forms of sabotage. If real results were achieved, he continued, the Voice of America could report these as evidence of opposition to the Castro regime through interviews with refugees and extracts from letters. The 1970s saw efforts to create more distance between the government and its broadcasters. In 1971, the CIA's funding of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was revealed and swiftly terminated. 5 years later, a law creating Voice of America's current charter was passed, including a barrier, a kind of firewall, intended to prevent government interference.
The firewall is often trotted out as an example of the shield that enables VOA to do independent, unfettered journalistic work. But the more intelligent and more informed journalists at VOA were always aware that there was pressure being imposed down the line, and that pressure could always end up on the desk of a specific writer or correspondent.
This close relationship between US foreign policy and US foreign-funded media continues to attract criticism today. US policy towards Iran has vacillated between suspicion and threats of regime change. The State Department's budget for broadcasting in Iran, shared between Voice of America's Persian service and Radio Farda, an offshoot of Radio Free Europe, is estimated at more than $30 million per year.
The fundamental mission of venues like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe is to pick and choose certain events that have actually happened and package it in a way that dovetails with the regime change narrative. For example, late last year we had a series of labor-related demonstrations in Iran, people demanding living wages and so forth. They pick particularly on certain kinds of slogans that say, if not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, this regime will fall.
این اعتراضا رو کی باعث شده؟ حکومت باعث شده مردم زندگیشون رو ول کنن بیان تو خیابون. کسی که امروز اومد بیرون فردا میاد بیرون.
We covered both sides of the issue. We covered what the protesters were saying. We covered what the government of Iran was saying about the protesters. We covered what the U.S. government was saying. And what we discovered is, even though in Iran it's against the law to access our content, we found the views of our content go like this before the protest, and then all of a sudden it went like that.
It is undeniable that US foreign-funded media do provide some public interest journalism in countries with limited press freedom, often at considerable risk to their journalists. Nonetheless, few would deny their status as instruments of soft power. From the 1940s until the end of the Cold War, the US, along with Britain's BBC, enjoyed hegemony in state-funded foreign broadcasting. But as hard power has begun to shift, and new players rise in an emerging multipolar world, they too have started to broadcast their perspectives to other parts of the globe. This is something that Washington has found difficult to accept. By attacking alleged Russian propaganda, the US fired a shot in a new cold information war.
Well, US authorities wanted a media war, and Russia's giving it right back to them.
So what that means is that the US government-funded outlets like Voice of America will probably have to register in Russia as foreign agents.
A shot that may well have ended up, inadvertently, jeopardizing their own state-funded media operation.
Finally, on the rare occasions that pop music and politics mix and it works, the results can be incendiary. U.S. actor, writer, and musician Donald Glover, better known as Childish Gambino, and his latest video, This Is America, have provoked a chain reaction. His sometimes shocking take on the ills of Black America, a video shot in a single take, got people talking and has produced tributes from other artists to tell stories about their own countries. One of them is Nigerian pop star Folarinde Falana, better known as Falz, whose This Is Nigeria tackles issues such as drug addiction, violence, corruption, and kidnapped Nigerian schoolgirls. It's at 2.8 million views and counting. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
This is Nigeria. Look how I'm living now. Look how I'm living now. Everybody be criminal. This is Nigeria. Look how we living now. Look what we eating now. Everybody be criminal. This is Nigeria. Just because I'm on TV now. Person we no get work is checking to see if my watch is original. This is Nigeria. Praise and worship we singing out. Pastor put his hand on the breast of his member. He's pulling the demon out. This is Nigeria. No electricity daily. Young people are still working multiple jobs and they talk say we lazy. This is Nigeria. Look how I'm living now. Look how I'm living now. Everybody be criminal. This is Nigeria. Look how we living now. Look what we eating now.